Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. This podcast is all about the past and the present. It is a no-holds-barred listener story fest. We have stories from past episodes, like the one about a Texas pilot who lost time, to a short story about hunted prey. We have tales from Doctors Without Borders and a brand new one about a ghost in a Sequiota Cave. We have 2 Bigfoot stories and a terrifying account that is simply titled Night Run. So many stories, but it wouldn't be a podcast without this 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Cold Cases are good cases. Sometimes when you revisit cold cases, you can solve new cases. Now you might be thinking that doesn't make any sense, and you would be right. But here is our story anyway.
Well, Sergeant, if it hadn't been for your smart sleuthing, we never could have pinned those forgeries on Richie Albert.
I think you can take a little of the credit yourself.
He's sure to be sent up for a nice long term. Too bad all cases aren't this simple.
You mean the Forsyth case?
Exactly. Over 4 months old, and we haven't cracked it yet. And I'm sure whoever forged those checks on Forsyth is the same person who murdered him.
Yes, it's obvious Forsyth found out who the forger was, and the guy had to bump him off or get caught.
Funny. I wonder.
What's that, Inspector?
Maybe we've got the murderer right under our noses and don't know it.
You mean Richie?
It's only a wild stab on my part, but we could have the handwriting on the 2 forgeries analyzed.
Say, Inspector, I think you've got something there. At least it's worth a try.
It certainly is. Come on, Sergeant. We're going over to the lab right now.
Any news yet, Inspector?
Not yet. They've got one of their best experts working on the handwriting. I'm going to call as soon as...
Uh-oh. That might be him now.
Inspector Kennedy speaking. Yes, Philip. Let's see. Okay, thanks a lot.
Well, Inspector?
That's the go-ahead, Sergeant. Hold down the fort. I'm going over to the city jail to pay a little call on Richie Albert.
What's the matter with you coppers? I confessed I forged those checks last week. Why can't you leave a guy alone?
I thought maybe you might have something more on your mind you'd like to get off.
Like what?
Like admitting you forged some checks on that Samuel J. Forsyth last July, and that you bumped him off a month later.
Murder? Listen, you, I may work a little different for a living than you, but I don't get mixed up in no murders.
That doesn't mean you wouldn't.
Well, you're barking up the wrong tree this time. Besides, I wasn't any place near here last summer.
You'll have to prove that, Richie.
Sure, I can prove it. I was working as a bookie down south at the Kentucky Derby. You can hang that charge on top of me, but I ain't taking no murder rap.
You mind telling me how long you were down there, Richie?
For 2 months. From July right through September. And keeping my nose to the grindstone all along.
Richie, what if I told you the handwriting on your forged checks and the Forsyth checks were the same type?
So what if they are? I still didn't have nothing to do with it. I told you where I was when Forsyth was murdered.
I'd like to believe you, Richie, but I'm afraid I can't. You're going up for Sam Forsyth's murder.
How does Inspector Kennedy know Richie Alberts is lying? Do you know the clue? In a moment we'll hear, but first...
Okay, I have to be honest and say I have no idea how the inspector knows that Richie is our guy. That one-sided phone call is probably the key. But what was he told? If I had to guess, I would say it had to do with the alibi. Anyway, pretty good story, and that is saying something.
And now, back to our story.
Inspector, you're a genius. 2 cases cleared up and only 1 man jailed. But I still don't know how you did it.
Very simple, Sergeant. Quite simple. You see, knowing that the signatures on both the forgery cases were the same type was something to go on. Richie's having an alibi about his whereabouts at the time of the murder could have cleared him, except for one thing. An innocent man doesn't need to fake an alibi. You see, Richie couldn't have been at the Kentucky Derby last August, as he said, because the Kentucky Derby is run only in the spring. When we caught him on that one, he broke down and confessed. It looks like Richie's rubber checks are going to bounce him right into the hot seat.
So I looked it up to be sure that the Kentucky Derby is in fact run in spring. As it turns out, it is. Also, it's coming up on May 4th and 5th. Now, I'm not sure that this was enough evidence, but it did prove that he was lying. Very good story for only 5 minutes, and do remember that it was brought to you by Cold Cases Are Good Cases. Well, it's more of what I did say this time. As I said at the top of the podcast, it's all about the past and the present. On this show, we're going to have nothing but your stories. Those sent in by you, the listener, and we've had a lot of those since the beginning. When I first started, it was just me telling you stories. But by episode 52, that changed with this story that also has the distinction of being the first one read by its author. It was submitted by Miss Carrie Francis from Molalla, Oregon, and is called The Hunted Prey. I do hope you enjoy it.
Well, it's about time, Honora muttered from her perch high in a tree. She leapt lightly from branch to branch and landed soundlessly a few feet behind the young man that had just made his way into the clearing. He was 20 years old, tall, with black hair and blue eyes. "Took you long enough, Eric. I only laid those trails 3 hours ago," she said, leaning casually against a tree that served as her watchtower. "I thought you were going to keep me up there all night." "I was too busy trying to get information out of those idiots you call friends," Eric snapped back at her. He didn't appreciate the slight on his tracking skills. It was bad enough the elders constantly reminded him of it. He didn't need it from his prey as well. She lost a bit of her cocky attitude at the mention of her friends. The last thing she wanted was to involve them in this. "They're not idiots," she said automatically. "They probably just sensed that you're a creeper and played dumb." "It's not my fault I have to act like a stalker towards you." His voice rose slightly. "If you just died like all the others, do you even hear yourself when you talk like that? Who exactly is talking right now, you or the elders?" she asked, not even bothering with the rest of his explanation. She'd heard it all before. "It doesn't matter, it's still my duty," he responded, laying his hand on his sword hilt. She made no move to grab for hers, though she didn't miss his movement. She had come tonight hoping to make him see reason, just like all the times before. "Right. It's your duty to kill me just because we're born with those stupid marks. Does that really make sense?" she asked as calmly as she could. "The tradition," Honora cut him off. "It was also a tradition to burn people alive because they had warts." She pulled away from the tree, and he tensed ever so slightly at the sudden movement. But he was far too nimble to pull his sword when she looked so defenseless. "It's not my place to question it." "Now will you take up your sword, or will you force me to attack a defenseless person?" he asked in a tone that showed he was no longer open to talk. Fine, whatever you want. Just remember, like always, we are both humans, and it's not too late for me to stop acting, saying, and walk away," he finished for her. She threw him a smile, which quickly disappeared as she put her hands on his swords, and he showed the first sliver of blade. "So it begins." She had 2 swords to his 1, but he had a lot more tricks up his sleeve. She led him further into the clearing, and as soon as she drew her swords, he attacked. The sound of metal and metal rang through the clearing as she easily blocked. She stayed mostly defensive. In all honesty, she was trying to make him feel better about his skills. He was sloppy this time. He clearly didn't want to be here, trying to kill her. But he did manage to surprise her, however. He pulled out a chain, and in an instant it was wrapped around her right wrist. The shock of it and the quick jerk he gave to the chain caused her to drop that sword. He swung his quickly, and she just barely managed to block with her left and give a flick of her wrist, causing him to either move his sword out or risk losing it. She quickly made a small slash on his side. "Ah!" His cry filled the clearing as he stumbled away from her. As soon as it was over, she realized what had gone wrong. Eric! Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut that deep. You surprised me, so my control was a little off. She was panicking slightly. She couldn't exactly take him to the hospital. How would she explain this? Why? Why do you do this? You don't kill me, even though you could. Easily. It just doesn't make sense, he said weakly. She went to his side to help support him, and he gave her an astonished gaze. I don't want to hurt you, you idiot. Now, come on. I'll just have to take you home for now, she said, and began moving him out of the clearing. Why? Came his weak question. She knew he meant, why won't she harm him? But she couldn't very well tell him the answer to that. How could you tell the person that is charged with killing you that you are in love with them?
That was a pretty good story. At the beginning of the podcast, most of the stories I received were short and sweet. I asked people to tell me how they found the podcast and what they used it for. Here are some of those early emails. I do want to say that at this time, I was still pretty new to podcasting and didn't know much about sound editing and, more importantly, how to archive the shows properly. I could reread the emails, but what's the fun in that? Let's listen to what it was like back then. This first one comes from episode 59. It was the first response I got on how people use the podcast. To this day, this is still one of my favorites. I guess because it told me that my podcast truly was traveling the world. This week, I had a very special email. However, the sender asked that it not be read on the show. I was saddened because I thought it was a great story and wanted to share it. I wrote the person back and got permission to read the email if I kept it completely anonymous and changed the location. So, here is that note. Hello. I wanted to write you and thank you for the great podcast. I am a nurse and volunteer each year with Doctors Without Borders. This past rotation, I was working in Africa with a mobile group that travels from village to village, helping with medical issues and illnesses. The travel between villages is difficult, long, and roads are sometimes non-existent. Before I left, I downloaded about 30 of your shows to my MP3 device. Listening to your programs made time pass, and that is very important to keep your spirits up. What I like about your program is the variety. You never know what is coming, except that it will be of good quality. Keep your shows coming, and thank you again. Signed, Anonymous. Well, first, let me thank you for allowing me to share your letter. That means a lot to me, but not as much as your note. You are the reason I do this show and will continue. Your email inspires me to do that much better. God bless your efforts in caring for the needy. This next clip comes from a few episodes later, and it's from Leah Gallagher. It was in response to an old-time radio story I played called The Vagabond King. I was touched when you played The Vagabond King because it originally aired while my grandmother worked at Oak Ridge, where they secretly worked on the atom bomb. I know she would have listened to it because she loved operettas. Thanks for your broadcasts. Regards, Leah. Let me just say thank you for your story. This is what Ron's Amazing Stories is all about, and I hope more people like you share them. This next clip is rather embarrassing. It was my attempt at a really bad Southern drawl. To those of you in the South, I promise to never do it again. First up, we have an email from Ethel Grimm. Yep, just like the TV show on NBC. Ethel writes, "When I was growing up in North Carolina, we didn't have much. We was a sight better off than your run-of-the-mill dirt farmer. There was a local radio station that played old-time radio every weekend, and as a family, we would spend our free time listening to those programs like they were fresh off the press. Today, I live in Chicago with my husband, Jacob, and when we listen to your podcast, I am taken back to those wonderful weekends. Thank you for your show." Well, Ethel, I hope you don't mind the southern drawl there. I should be thanking you for this great story, and bless you for sharing it with us. I receive a lot of emails from folks who just want to tell me how my podcast was being used. This was one of the early ones. I didn't read it well, and I was going to redo it, but I wanted to use the original broadcasts for this show. So, here it is. We have a bit of a different segment this week. This email was left in the suggestion box with no sender's name. It says, "My mother just passed a few weeks ago. She was an avid listener to your podcast. I would load her iPod Shuffle up with a few shows and let it go. She would sit on the porch of the family home and listen. She enjoyed it very much and wanted me to tell you so many times. I never got around to it until now. She lived a great life as a farmer's wife and horse trainer. My dad is still with us and misses her every day." Well, first, let me send my condolences to you and your family. Your mother sounds like a good woman. It means a lot to me that she enjoyed the program. I think instead of reading the rest of the tweets this week, I'll close it off here and dedicate this show to your mom. Thank you for sharing your story. After this one aired, I did hear back from the writer. The mother's name was Muriel, and her daughter loved that I played the story. Interesting fact here is this particular email led to the creation of the segment As Read By. How about that? There are a ton of these short emails, and this is only a very small sample. I probably could do a whole show on these alone. I do want to thank everyone who sends emails to the podcast. I do read and respond to every one. And now this. We have 2 brand new stories sent in to the show this week. I thought that was pretty cool, and I'll read them both for you. The first comes from Richard Parks from Springfield, Missouri. I love this story because it comes with some actual proof. And that's always fun and welcome. He writes, "Hello, my name is Richard, and I have a story to tell. I have lived in Springfield, Missouri all of my life. We're known for hot summers and humid climate. It was during the summer of 1985 that my story took place. It was just a few days past my 12th birthday. We were all down by the lake in Sequiota Park. There are several caves here that you can play in and explore. I was off with my brother, and we were playing a game we called Indiana Jones. I was Indy, and my brother was Short Round. I had my whip, which was really a stick, and of course my brother was a karate expert. Just like in the movies, we entered the caves, and we were looking for the lost tombs of King Tut. My brother was fighting a giant spider that was attacking us when I heard laughter, like a little girl giggling. I spun around, and there was nothing around us. My brother heard it too, so now our game changed to find the source of the giggle. We ran around looking, but every time we got close, the giggles came from somewhere else in the cave. It was playing with us. Finally, we got tired of trying to follow the girl, and we started to leave the cave. Then it spoke from right behind us.
Please don't leave.
This freaked us out, and my brother started to run. I turned to see what could only be described as an apparition. It had no real shape and was more of a lighted mist than anything. I screamed and ran out of the cave as well. Our parents didn't believe us, but we did go back to the cave. We searched high and low, but no more giggles or voices. I swear my story is true, and my brother backs me up. Today, the caves are closed to the public, so no more adventures there. Years later, after the internet became a thing, I found this in my local newspaper archives. It does back up my story some. Springfield police were dispatched to Sequiota Park at 10:12 a.m. on August 14th to investigate the death of a 3-year-old child. The child, identified as Jade Cheery, was already deceased prior to the officers' arrival on the scene. An autopsy is being conducted by Greene County Medical Examiner's Office to confirm the cause of death. Detectives continue to investigate and are asking anyone who has any information about this incident to contact the Springfield Police Department. It was dated 8/14/1972. I couldn't find any other reference other than this. Richard. Great story, Richard, and thank you for sending it to us. By the way, according to legend, Sequiota is an Indian word which means many springs. In 1920, the state bought that property, constructed a hatchery, and several fish ponds. The largest cave contains a waterfall inside. Man, that does sound like a fabulous place. Our second story comes from Nebraska. The only name I have attached to it is E. Smith 402. Just a side note, if you want me to read your name on the air, be sure to tell me. I did use his IP address to determine the state. E wrote, I want to share my story with you. I was working as a rodeo clown in the late 90s in Wyoming, Oregon, and Washington. Pretty much ran the total circuit in those days. There were a lot of late-night drives going from show to show, and I was driving from Pendleton, Oregon to Yakima, Washington on the night that my story occurred. I had just crossed over to the Columbian River and was back on the main highway heading up into Sequoia Pass when nature called. I pulled over to the side of the road, ducked into the woods, and did my business. I was heading back to my truck when I heard a loud thumping. It sounded like something was hitting a tree with a baseball bat. Now, I had heard that Bigfoot communicated like this, so I, being an idiot, grabbed a fallen limb and responded back. The reply I got was not what I was hoping for. It started to rain rocks. Not just pebbles here, we're talking full-sized boulders. I turned and ran for cover under a fallen tree until the pelting stopped. I climbed out and made haste to my truck. As I got in, I glanced back at the tree line and saw a small pine tree about 18 feet tall, shaking violently. Then came the scream that I'll never forget. I slammed my door, gunned the engine, and burned rubber out of there. Well, that's quite a story, and I can confirm that the area you were in is Bigfoot country. Thank you for sharing your story, and please do contact me with your actual name so I can give you credit. And now, here are some more stories from Podcast Past. Next up on the show, we have a collection of 3 stories sent in by you guys, played on previous episodes. These are some of the best, scariest, and head-scratching tales that we've ever had on the program. Again, I use the original recordings for these, and I do hope that you enjoy them. The first one comes from episode 211 and is a real head-scratcher. It was part of the What's That You Say segment from the show, and I think we probably should have called it The Twilight Zone.
What's that you say?
A couple of podcasts back, we had a lost time story from Texas. This week, we're back to Texas for round 2, this time via Atlanta, Georgia. Confused? Let's unravel this mystery with this week's What's That You Say? I received the following email from Jim Richards. He currently resides in Atlanta, but claims his roots are firmly placed in Fort Worth, Texas. Jim is a private pilot working for his own airline. Jim wanted everyone to know that he is not crazy, not prone to general seizures, and does not take drugs or alcohol. Here is Jim's story in his own words. I am a private pilot, just like you see on television. I hire myself out for parties, special freight, and take passengers just about anywhere they want to go. I own 2 planes. The first is a Cessna Skyhawk for those quick deliveries and flights. The second is a Cessna Caravan for larger groups and cargo. I have over 30 years of flight experience and have logged more hours than Chuck Yeager. Okay, I'm not real sure about that second claim. I have seen a lot of strange things up there, most of which can be explained. Once, while flying a Heart for transport from Austin to Dallas, my plane was bracketed by a series of lights. The med tech that was with me saw them as well. They seemed to be following us, and then, abruptly, they disappeared. I was never able to determine what it was, but I think the med tech had the best explanation. He thought it was the Heart's original owner saying goodbye. This type of thing is common and doesn't worry me much. However, what happened on that last day of August in 1996 will forever haunt me. I did not fly for an entire year after that. I had been contracted to fly some dailies for a major film company to Houston for review by its director. In case you're wondering, yes, I'm purposely not using real names. I was on the clock. There would be a bonus of $600 if I got the film there by 6 p.m. It was going to be tight, but if everything fell into place, I would have a steak dinner that night at the Papa Bros, best steakhouse in Houston. The flight started as normal can be. I would be flying alone, no extra cargo, and limited fuel to make the plane as light as possible. I had the flight plan, Fort Wayne to Houston, with a short stop in DFW for fuel and rest. The pre-checks were done, and I was waiting in line, looking good. It was a beautiful summer day, no clouds and unlimited visibility. Perfect conditions. You could not ask for better. The first leg of the journey went without incident. I made it to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in record time. That steak was looking pretty good. I was back in the air in about 30 minutes. I was about 45 minutes out of DFW when the plane started to shake violently. I checked everything and found nothing wrong. There was no storm activity or air currents that could account for it. Then, as soon as it began, everything went quiet. It felt like flying a flight simulator rather than a real plane. Not even the vibration of the engine could be felt. I called into Houston for any weather updates, and all I got was an eerie silence, followed by a melodic tone that came across the speakers. Time seemed to stop, or at least it was moving so slowly I couldn't perceive it. I looked out the side window, and it was then I noticed for the first time that the sun was in the wrong place. It should have been overhead this time of day, but there it was, due west of my present position. The plane itself seemed to glow with a faint green hue. Silence. Freaky cold silence. I wanted to scream, but I held my wits and tried to bank the plane to the right. No response. The controls were like limp noodles in my hands. This went on for what seemed like hours, or was it seconds? I really don't know. I've had dreams about this day all of the time, some more terrifying than others. Finally, when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, I burst out of the green sphere, and again the plane surged and shook. The engine roared as if it had just taken hold of air for the first time. I began a downward spiral and nearly lost total control. Finally, ever so slowly, the plane began to respond. I realized that I had not been breathing. I took a deep swallow, nearly passed out, but again my training took over and I fully recovered the aircraft. The first thing I did was check my location in time. Not a second had passed. I was in the same position in time I was when the shaking had first stopped. All of the logbooks and recorders recorded a perfect flight. Houston had never lost my signal, and the same was true with Dallas. I made the rest of the trip with no issues, and I even got my $600 bonus. Jim went on to say that when he landed the plane, he didn't go get a steak. In fact, he rented a car and drove back to Fort Worth. He had his plane flown home by a friend, and for the next year, only worked in the office. After some extensive personal therapy, he was able to climb into the cockpit again, but says he's never gotten over his experience. This is yet another incredible tale. It amazes me that you guys keep sending them in one after the other. Do we really understand this world of ours? I'm going to have to say no. Thank you, Jim Richards, for sharing this with us. It sends chills down my spine each time I read it. Here's another one from the What's That You Say, and it just might be the scariest story I have ever heard in my life. It still sends chills down my spine every time I hear it because, well, the segment tells it much better. This one came from episode 229.
What's that you say?
This time I'm happy to say we have a story sent in by you guys. Beth Myers from Calgary, Canada, contacted me a few months ago wanting to tell her story. She said she wasn't a writer and wanted it told well. So I sat with Beth on the phone and we collaborated on what you're about to hear. I have to say, of all the stories we've had on the show, this one really shook my core. Here is Beth's story called The Night Run. I was 16 years old when all this happened, a night that will haunt me for the rest of my days. Some will not believe my tale, and others will say it was just my imagination. Either way, for me, it was real. I was standing outside the local bar and grill. I couldn't go in, but there was no way I was going to miss my brother and his band's debut. It was the mid-90s, and grunge was all the rage. It was mostly an American music form, but we in Calgary had found it as well. I stood out there for the entire first set, and from the sounds of the crowd, they were enjoying themselves. I had promised my dad that I would head home right after. What he didn't know was that I was alone. He never would have let me go had I told him the truth. It started with a feeling, like I was being followed. I looked around the streets and they were all clear. I heard the noise coming from the bar as my brother started up his second set. But everything else was quiet. I thought it was just my nerves, and I continued to walk home. I was about a block from the bar when I heard it. A sound that I will never forget. When I try to describe it, I begin to shake and I feel like I want to run and hide all over again. It was a high-pitched wail of such anger and sadness. It made me feel small and exposed. So I ran. My thoughts were simple. Get home and do it the fastest way possible. I didn't think about where I was, and I ended up at the gates of the Central Island Cemetery. I had used it for years as a shortcut. I stood there looking through the large gate and realized it was too late to turn back now. So I slipped through the broken section and kept running. The whole time I felt like I was being pursued. I was running through the main burial grounds, dodging gravestones, when I felt its first attack. It slammed me in the back and propelled me forward. The force of the assault was staggering. It was hard to breathe, but somehow I had managed to maintain my balance and kept moving forward. The second hit came from a blind side. It sent me to the ground, and the real pain began. I took a deep breath and looked around. I could see nothing, but I knew I wasn't alone. We were playing a game of cat and mouse, and the mouse had just lost round 1. I got up. I knew by the pain that I was hurt, but I started running again. It was then the second wail came, angrier and closer than the first. I remember praying, screaming, and then even crying as I ran through the dead. I could feel their laughter at my folly. Here was a little girl who thought she could outrun a demon. I'm not sure who saw who first. The graveyard sexton was out looking for the source of the commotion of his charge. It was his job to track the occupants and grave sites of the place. I saw him and ran straight at him. The beast must have saw my plan and took one last strike. My right arm was hit hard and began to bleed. My next memory was falling into the open arms of the sexton. When I awoke, I found myself lying on a couch in an unfamiliar home. A policeman was hovering over me saying, Miss, are you awake? Miss. I managed to nod my head and then blacked out again. The next time I woke, I was in the hospital with my parents and brother beside me. Beth told me she had 2 broken ribs, massive bruises, and nearly bled to death from the cut on her arm. She tried to tell her family what happened. It was clear they didn't believe her story and created their own. When the sexton at the graveyard was questioned, he told of a 7-foot man holding 2 small spades in each hand running from the scene. After having spent so much time with Beth and talking with her, I believe that something happened. On a footnote, she never used that shortcut again. My thanks to Beth for sharing her story with us. I can tell you that she had a rough time recounting the event, as you can probably imagine. This last one has to be the most incredible story we've ever had on the show. It has actual proof that this really happened, right down to a recording that was taken during the event. It came from episode 268 and was part of the As Read By segment.
As Read By. Amazing stories read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have something that I think is pretty special. I received the following email last week. I read it to you now in its entirety, unaltered. Ron, please find 2 attachments to this email. One is a text-only file that tells a story that I promised that I would never tell. The second is an MP3 file, which is the only proof I can offer that what I say is true. I'm not a good writer, and I know that you are. Please edit the text file, if you wish, to fix my poor writing. I'm older now, and I wanted to tell my story. Clear my head, if you will. I give you my permission to use all of this on your show. Please don't try to contact me. The email account I used to send this has been deleted. So that I can contact you in the future, I enclosed a secret word so that you will know it's me. Thank you, 3xstranger@gmail.com. To say that I was taken aback by this would be an understatement. The cloak and dagger thing makes it all kinda cool, though. I wrestled with whether or not I should tell this man's story. However, after reading through it, I decided that even if all of this is a lie, it's still a good tale. I don't ask you to believe it, and for me, I've decided to file it under undecided. I did edit what you're about to hear, but I made sure to maintain the original feel and intent. I will play the attached MP3 file after the story. So, here it is, the adventure which I have called Gigantopithecus. It was to be the hunting trip of the year. We'd been planning it for some time, and the three of us were finally ready. Myself, my friend Mark, and his brother John had everything packed into a 1959 F-100 Ford pickup truck. We had enough food and supply for 2 weeks' worth of hunting, fishing, and camping. The past winter had been rough, so the Fish and Game Department limited the issue of elk tags that year. We only had one for the three of us. It was our plan to make the most of it, and we had picked an area sure to be rich with wildlife. However, it was quite remote and would present us with many challenges. We arrived at our campsite. We quickly set about putting up tents, building food traps, digging a fire pit, and it was our practice to remove a wheel from the truck, hide it and the spare in the woods near camp. We'd had a vehicle stolen some years back and did not want to relive that story. The first 3 days were glorious. We had October fishing for rainbow trout and Dolly Varden, hiking through the countryside, and many other activities to keep us busy. Of course, each day we would head out and search for elk sign. We had not seen anything, and in fact, the wildlife in general seemed to be scarce. We were not worried because we knew the elk were migrating south this time of year, and your fortune would change one day to the next. On the third day, we were out inspecting deer trails when a hush fell over the area. It was hard to describe. It was like the entire forest stopped and was holding its breath. This lasted for several minutes, and as fast as it came, things returned to normal. John was the first to say, "Well, that was creepy." To which I replied, "Yeah, let's get back to camp." We had left Mark alone there to cook the evening meal, and it was getting late in the day. When we arrived at camp, Mark was nowhere to be found. The dinner, consisting of fresh trout, beans, and cornbread, was set on the fire pit. The aroma was nothing short of breathtaking. Hiking through the hills had left us tired and hungry, and both of us felt the call of that campfire's treat. It would have to wait, though, because the forest silence was broken with a scream that could have only come from Mark. At first, it seemed to be coming from everywhere, but eventually we determined a direction and ran through the forest. We found our friend slumped over a fallen tree, unconscious, but he appeared to be uninjured. We helped him back to camp and was able to rouse him. When he came to, his eyes went wide with fear, and he asked, "Did you see it?" "See what?" his brother asked. "The beast, as big as a grizzly, but man-like. A gorilla, maybe. I don't know. It was right there in my face. I screamed and he, well, left, I guess." Mark was terrified. But in the end, we all agreed that it had to be a grizzly, and he was lucky to be alive. That would also explain the lack of wildlife in the area. We finished our dinner and cleaned up. We took extra care to get the rest of our groceries safely protected, high up in the trees in the food traps. Also that night, we decided to have a guard on duty to watch things. We broke up the assignment into 3 parts, and I took the middle watch. I was about halfway through my watch when the sounds began. I awoke Mark and John. Together, we heard a series of yells and grunts. The series would run for about 4 to 5 minutes, stop, and then start again. It was terrifying to listen to, and it went on for what seemed to us to be hours. At one point, I went to the truck and got my tape recorder and made a record of it. The 3 of us spent the rest of the night huddled around the campfire, eventually falling into an uneasy sleep. I would hear those shrieks in my dreams for many years to come. The next morning, the area was calm. The forest seemed to have returned to normal, and it was peaceful. Mike pointed out that he didn't remember things feeling like this any of the 3 previous days. I think he was right about that. We were just starting to move around camp when I heard John let out a gasp. I turned to my friend and said, "What is it, John?" He just stood there, pointing at the pickup and shaking his head slowly. I looked over and could not believe my eyes. Both tires to the pickup were leaning against the back gate. On the gate itself was a very dead bull elk. Well, we packed up quickly, loaded everything into the pickup, including the elk meat, its pelt, and horns. The rest of it we buried in the fire pit. We decided to end our vacation early that year, and we took the meat to the butcher's. We never talked about that trip again, decreeing that it was our secret. John took the horns, and we all split up the meat, and I still have the recording I made that night. What was it? Who was it? Hairy apes, Bigfoot, Sasquatch? All I will say is I feel a burden lifted by sharing my story with you and Ron's Amazing Stories. All I can say is, holy cow, that is a story. I have so many questions, and I have to say I'm a bit frustrated that I can't ask any of them. I've heard quite a few cryptid stories, but nothing like this. I do know that the events must have taken place in the Northwest, perhaps as far north as Alaska. I do, though, want to thank you for sharing your story with us. One last thing on this one. 3X Stranger did send along an MP3 file. I assume this is the recording he made that day. I will warn you before I play it. It's rather creepy, but it does add some credibility to this whole thing. Let's listen. Pretty creepy, and I don't think I would have stayed the night if that was going on. Again, thank you for sharing your story with us. And now this. There you have it, some of the best stories we've ever had on the show, and I do hope that you enjoyed hearing them again. did you like this podcast? I know that it was a lot to take in and that you heard my voice a lot. I do want to know what you thought about it, so please send in your feedback. What did you like? What would you change? And more importantly, would you listen to it again? As we begin the 8th year of the podcast, I can tell you that change is coming. I'm hoping to rely more on your stories for the podcast and do the OTR stuff on the radio show. Many of you have been asking if I'm going to make the radio show into a separate podcast. The answer is that after a great deal of thought, I have decided to make those available and downloadable. It may take the form of a separate podcast or be folded into the blog. Stay tuned for that answer. Now I'm going to forego the normal rantings and just say this. Thank you for listening, and I hope you do come again to find out what are Ron's amazing stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.